Hey folks, it's Nate. It's time I got back to the drawing board, and tonight we're looking at Bigfoot Bill again. Now, I normally take a couple days, read a book twice before I talk about it, and the reason for that is because I really like to digest and mull over what I've read, the story, and all the different elements and how they fit together before I give my impressions on it. And I didn't do that with Bigfoot Bill because I was pretty excited to read the book. It was a very fun story. But I said some things in my first video on it that, on further reflection, I have read the book a second time. I've had a couple of days, and I think I wasn't entirely fair to the story, in particular as regards the villain. And I want to kind of use this as a springboard to talk a little bit more about villains and what makes the best villains good and interesting. And in Bigfoot Bill, I think we see the first execution of that really well. Now, in my initial video on Bigfoot Bill, I talked about how the Mothman didn't feel as impressive as Poseidon. He felt kind of secondary, even in the comic that has his name, Shadow of the Mothman. He felt a little extraneous. And the first time through the story, things were just moving so fast, and I was keeping up. And I was just thinking about, what is Bill going to do next, that I didn't think as much about what the other parts in the story were doing. So I think I was a bit unfair. And what I think is important here is to recognize that the Mothman seems to be a method to help us understand Poseidon better. And as such, he's not really his own thing. He speaks on behalf of a part of Poseidon's personality that wouldn't come out otherwise. And you really see that here on this page. This is page 83. And it comes about as the Mothman is gathering power from people's fear. And he comes to Poseidon and he says, "What's wrong, Poseidon? Afraid?" And Poseidon says, "Poseidon fears nothing." The Mothman says, "Then look at me." And, the real question is, what does he fear? So Mothman asks, "The fear of a god is all I need to complete my transformation." And Poseidon says, "I fear being alone. I am alone." And that's a very interesting insight into who Poseidon is. And it sets up, I think, more in the story. Because earlier in the story, when Bill first meets Poseidon, he thinks Poseidon's just sort of, role-playing or play-acting or something like that. And so Bill asks if he can be Zeus, and Poseidon's like, "Well, Zeus is dead." And that kind of convinces Bill he doesn't want to be Zeus. Be that as it may, I think what we're seeing here is the beginnings of a picture of Poseidon as a villain who is driven to what he does by his circumstances. He's lonely and he hates it. And I'm willing to bet that all the other Greek gods that he knew that formed the foundation of his identity and his social circle and his family are dead. And he's going to try and do something, probably with the assistance of the Kraken and his own powers as a deity, that will probably hurt a lot of people because he is a villain, but that will let him get his family back. And that's a very simple, understandable motivation that makes Poseidon both more convincing as a relatable person, but also more horrifying as a villain. Because if you are willing to go to these great extremes, cause chaos and death and destruction, eat poor shark bite guy, just to get your family back, and yet you have no empathy to all the other families that you are putting in the same position as Poseidon is in right now, that's horrible. That's terrible. It's the essence of a villain. That kind of selfishness, that kind of callousness to destruction around you is what makes villains so detestable. And at the same time, that very relatable drive that brings him to it kind of, it makes the villain believable. A lot of the times in comic books, villains are like, say, Apocalypse, who just his and I'm going more off the TV show than actual knowledge of Apocalypse from the comics. I'm sure he's a much deeper character in there, but he just seems very, very cardboard cutout-ish. You know, he wants to wipe out the human race because he's going to put something better in its place. And yeah, I get that there's like themes there of eugenics and evolution, and the replacement of one gene pool with another, and genocide, colonization, all these other things. But Apocalypse himself is very flat. Just because he plays around with deep themes doesn't make him interesting. Poseidon achieves that in a way that a lot of comic book villains don't, and we wouldn't be able to see that as we're introducing him and setting him up without the Mothman. So I think in my initial video, I was unkind to the Mothman as a character and his role in the story, which is very important. And as this window into Poseidon, he serves very well. And going off of that, just the nature of Poseidon as this very complex character, I think that that's really something writers need to look at, that they need to work towards, giving villains these very understandable motivations as opposed to just oppression or my superior race or whatever you have. And rather than since each villain is so unique and has to fit all the needs of its story, I just wanted to point to a couple of other examples of this writing, especially characters that have a larger library you can go through and see how it is done on a larger scale. The first of them is Klaus Wolfenbach, who is one of my favorite villains of all time from the comic Girl Genius. This is actually a webcomic now, although it did have physical volumes printed. It was printed as an indie comic, I think, back in the day, although the easiest way to read it is as the webcomic at girlgeniusonline.com, I believe is the URL. But Klaus is a fascinating villain because he has conquered all of Europe in this steampunk era, and he rules it with an iron fist, but he doesn't like ruling. He doesn't want to be the ruler of Europe. He doesn't really take any pleasure from it. He doesn't leverage it to his advantage. By and large, he's just there basically to prevent the chaos. He is an overbearing father gone way out of line. He actually describes it as being in charge of a kindergarten at one point. But his motivation is interesting. And I think that the closest look we get at it, because Klaus does not talk about himself very much. That's just, he's very taciturn to begin with. But the closest look we get at it is very early on in the story. We get a little bit of his backstory, and he says, "I was away for a few years, and I came back to a world in ruins. Death, destruction, chaos, the endless fighting. It was like the Heterodyne boys had never existed. Things were worse than ever. So I stopped it, and I did it my way this time. No more negotiating, no more promises, no more second chances. And I did it alone, because I had to. And it worked." And, as you read more about Klaus, and you begin to understand that in his young days, he established peace in Europe between all these warring factions. And he did it with the help of his two closest friends. And when he left Europe for a short time period and came back, everything was gone. So he didn't play nice anymore. And you start to get the impression of a character who has a deep sense of responsibility. And much like Poseidon in Bigfoot Bill, he's also lonely because all his friends are gone. They've disappeared. He has no idea where they are. And he's trying, it seems, to uphold some part of what they did so that the happiest time of his life, when he was a young man trying to bring peace to Europe, some part of that can still be alive. And that's a very understandable motivation. In the past, Klaus did a good thing, and some other people trashed it. and now he's pissed and he's trying to put it back together. But he does so in such a tyrannical way. He overreaches very frequently. And he does it out of, a good place. In fact, many things about Klaus are very good. He is a very devoted father. He looks out for the best interests of the largest number of people he can. He's simply without mercy in doing the good things he does. And as a result, very frequently, he makes sacrifices that they're heartless. I mean, he is he's a very hard man. And it's very difficult sometimes to think of Klaus as a villain, although he does fill that role in the story quite a bit. And those contradictions in the character, his motivations versus his methods versus the question, is there any other way this could have actually been done, make him compelling not only as a villain, but as a character. And they make the struggles of Agatha, the hero in the story, against him that much more interesting, because Agatha can't just go out there and smash whatever the Baron's doing, because 99% of the time, he's doing a good thing. He's just doing it in a very horrific way. And that's interesting. That makes him compelling. It gives him legs. He's not just set up there to be knocked down in every story. Now, the last character that I think really embodies this is the character of Destinova from Battle Angel Alita. And this is not the character from the movie. So if you've seen Alita Battle Angel, I just need you to take that Nova and throw him out the window. He is a cardboard cutout. He's a terrible character. He's a terrible villain. Forget about him. We're going to talk about the real Nova. The real Nova is interested in the question of free will and what we can do against the circumstances we are in. He tends to refer to this as karma. And it does have, a very real element of the sins of the past being revisited upon you. But ultimately, that's not what his problem is. He describes it in a couple of different places. Here in Volume 5, I believe this is chapter, let me double check. I believe that would be chapter 29. His lover asks, do you think he, Zappin, who is the villain of this arc, do you think he was able to conquer his karma? And Nova says, probably not. The sad reality is people have a hard enough time just surviving. But still we live on, repeating the same mistakes time and time again. That's our life story, our history. And how we comprehend and deal with that truth is the basis of my lifelong research. Okay, so ultimately, he's looking at the mistakes we make and the problems we encounter over and over again and how we overcome them. But what specifically is he looking at? Well, in Volume 9, he says this: now becomes the past in an instant, and everyone will eventually die. Destiny triumphs over human knowledge and goes mad. That is the way of things. I spit upon this frail, crazed world. I spit upon the second law of thermodynamics. Through his whole career, Nova has been trying to overcome death itself. We've seen him bring multiple people back from the brink of death. He himself has been stabbed in the head and cut apart, and he even gets decapitated and survives. So Nova just hates this idea that things come to an end. Nova is seeking immortality. He doesn't want his dreams and his goals to be blocked, but he knows that circumstances and ultimately the world we live in dictate that they will come to an end. And he just hates it. And he fights against it, and he fights against every roadblock that's put in front of him overcoming death. He tortures people, he mutilates them, he uses living human experiments because he's convinced if he does these things, death can be beaten. And he can just go on and satisfy all his intellectual curiosity eventually, because one day he will conquer entropy. And while many of the things that Nova does are horrific, Just about everyone has rebelled at the thought that they're going to die. I mean, this survival instinct is baked into people. And, Nova goes around and he helps people do the things they want to do. A lot of the time, that's what he does. He asks people, if you could have anything you desired, what would it be? And then he does his best to give them the power to do exactly that. It's very interesting, the outcomes of this, even though they are, a lot of the times he gives power to very evil people who then cause a lot of pain and suffering. So the idea of Nova is fascinating. Like, who is this guy who just goes around and hands out cybernetic bodies to people so they can live out their dreams? Is he a good man? Is he a bad man? Do we want people like that in the world or not? And ultimately, it's a very difficult question to answer. He is a villain. He unapologetically causes the suffering of people. But he also makes us think, and that gives him a lot of value as a villain. It gives him a lot more legs. It makes him much more interesting than a villain who is someone like Apocalypse, who just shows up and is really powerful and hard to deal with. Or a villain like Galactus, who is, again, much the same thing. And those villains, they don't get made a whole lot anymore. It's strange because these villains let us look at a dark part of ourselves without facing all the consequences of that dark part running free. And they let us grapple with that without hurting those around us. And that gives villains a lot of value in storytelling as well. So I would really like to see more of these deeper, more difficult kinds of villains in stories. And I know not every villain can be one. After all, the Mothman wasn't, but he still served a very good purpose in the story, and it was interesting. So think about villains. Think about the way they're presented, and try and make them better. That's what I hope to do, and I hope everyone else will too. Congrats to Doug for making it a really good villain. Better one than I originally gave it credit for. Anyway, that's all I got for today. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, well, there's a like button and subscribe button down below. Use them as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.